This podcast has been produced on the traditional lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples. From 2RPH and the Wicking Trust, this is Passing Thoughts. I'm Rob Caldor. This is the podcast where we explore death, dying and everything in between. Today's episode is about the Buddhist approach to death. Barbara Sullivan speaks with Venerable Tsultrim, a Buddhist spiritual care practitioner, about how she views death. Venerable Tsultrim is an Australian Tibetan Buddhist nun, counsellor and educator. She is widely known for her work in palliative care counselling, mindfulness workshops, suicide prevention, and leading Buddhist retreats, as well as being a podcaster. In our Before We Go segment, I dive deep into a cutting-edge TV show that explores the concept of a bucket list in an unexpected way, so stick around. But first, Barbara Sullivan speaks with Venerable Tsultrim.
Venerable Tsultrim, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today on Passing Thoughts. Thanks for joining us. And you commented to me at one point that, and a quote, I think I get this quote right, that death is certain, the time of death is uncertain. Now, is that in the colloquial sense of your time's up, or do you mean something deeper by that?
This is a fundamental aspect of our existence, is that we know death will always come to us, like anything that lives will die, but we can't predict when. And so that's the uncertain component. But we tend to treat life and death as if both are very predictable. But there is nothing predictable about either. And so we have far less suffering if we can accept the reality of first of all, the inevitability of death, but also the unpredictability of death. Because then when things happen to us or to others, we don't suffer to quite the same degree if we have an acceptance that we don't know when time of death will come. For some, it's the moment after conception. If you imagine that there is a continuum of time, beings are dying at every single point on that continuum of time somewhere in the universe.
The cause of death is birth.
Oh, yes. From a Buddhist point of view, yes, indeed. We have this saying, as soon as we're born, that's where we're heading. We're heading directly towards death. But we meditate on death every day. It's part of our practice, this idea of impermanence and death. But to think that we're all going to have a long life is not accepting the unpredictability of death. There is nobody that dies today that expected to die today, because we all have this presumption that we will have a long life.
So I'm interested in exploring this notion of consciousness after clinical death, so that when we tend in Western society to talk about death, it's when you are pronounced life extinct. Does the immediate period of continued consciousness in Buddhism, does it happen to everyone and last about the same amount of time?
It does happen to everyone. So consciousness, we would say in Buddhism that consciousness, it has been since beginningless time, but it is formless. So consciousness does not have a form. It is a very complex topic, consciousness, but we would say that this thing that we call consciousness or mind continues life after life after life, because of course as a Buddhist we believe in reincarnation. So we believe not in just one life, that we believe that this consciousness has continued and exists because of the previous moment of consciousness. And that's why we would say consciousness is beginningless. It has no beginning and it has no end, because this moment of consciousness is dependent on the previous moment of consciousness, which was dependent on the previous moment of consciousness. So there is no start, and therefore there is no end to it. And then that consciousness continues to exist each time a new form occurs as the result of rebirth. So as a result of our rebirth, we would say that we have been born and died many, many times, but our consciousness continues.
But in that immediate period after clinical death, and increasingly this medical science is indicating that the mind, there is some activity and there's the warmth, I think.
They talk about the warmth above the heart chakra that you can, yes. So the consciousness leaves the body when depends on the level of realization. So for some very highly realized practitioners or Buddhas, there's evidence now where people have maintained a level of consciousness in this body still, even though the body may be clinically dead, that there's still some element of movement within the consciousness. There's evidence for even up to a period of 3 weeks, 21 days. So the more realized you are, the more you can maintain that state of meditation without requiring the body. So the body can still actually even remain fresh during that time. Whereas for the majority of us, when we die, the body starts to deteriorate very quickly. And the consciousness can leave the body any time between the moment of death and, they say, 49 days. For whatever reason, it's sort of 7 lots of 7 days. So the consciousness can leave the body at any point, depending on, again, the level of realization of the person.
And so it has implications, doesn't it, things like organ donation, for example. How do you feel about that in Buddhism?
There's certainly doctrinal aspects to that. My view is that as a completely unrealized being, I have no realizations at all in my consciousness. So for me, there is an element of the intention behind doing kind, compassionate actions. And because I have, for me, no level of realization, the likelihood of my consciousness staying within this body for any period of time is highly unlikely. So for me, it would be a kind act and what we would call a bodhisattva act, so an act of compassion, to be able to share some of my organs with another being. So I am on the, organ donor list, and if the circumstances allowed, so long as my intention was really strong and I had that capacity to be able to keep a strong intention, because intention is very, very important from a Buddhist point of view. So to be able to have that intention and wishing that may this body be of benefit to others, I suspect there's probably far greater karmic benefit in doing that than doing nothing and just allowing the body to go on to a next rebirth, because the moment of death is really important from a karmic perspective and from a rebirth perspective. So that moment of death, the more that you could have kindness, compassion, love, wisdom in your consciousness, even if you couldn't have much influence in terms of rebirth or in terms of how long that consciousness can remain, you can absolutely have some element of influence of the mindset, the attitude, the heart at that moment of death. So there would probably be Buddhists out there that would disagree with me, but that's perfectly okay.
And a lot of people who don't practice Buddhism, though, have a sense, for example, in institutions like aged care facilities or in hospitals, when their loved one dies, there is sort of this furious hustle to clear the space, if you like. We've got to turn the room over. We've got to get everything out. We've got to clear the bed. And there's an unseemly haste about that for a lot of people who just still feel the presence of that person in the room.
Yes, look, I think this is typical. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one is commercial. There's people on the waiting list, and this will happen in hospital as well, in palliative units in hospitals where somebody dies, but they've got somebody who's waiting to come into a room, or somebody in emergency who's palliative who's waiting to come in. So I think on one level there is a commercial component to that. And then I think on the other level is that, our society sees death as very negative, as a bad thing, and that there is a negative energy associated with death. But that's a conditioned view. That's a construct. There's no sense of reality around that. I mean, we are born and we die. These are just very normal, natural components of our existence as living beings. Everything that lives dies. And we have no difficulty when the bunch of flowers that we've had in our vase sitting on our table dies and we need to throw them onto the compost or whatever. We have no issue with that. We don't question that. We don't see it as disgusting or negative. We just accept it. But when it comes to our own bodies, or the bodies of other humans in particular, we have this whole negative projection around it. Now, I need to qualify that a little bit, because that doesn't negate the sadness or the grief around it, of course, but the whole idea that death is bad. Death is sad, but it's not bad. It's normal. Wherever it is on the time continuum, death is normal. But I often think that haste is around that idea that death is something ugly and something negative that we need to be rid of as quickly as possible.
Well, and many cultures have a transition period, I suppose, that allows for a grieving process. And it seems that in the Buddhist post-death period, that transition period, you have a number of rituals that are all very focused on positivity, but that helps the people that are doing the grieving.
I mean, I think it's about just understanding that everything is impermanent. It's like grief comes out of the idea that we have lost something significant. Grief comes out of the meaning that we place on that significant thing. But I think the more that we can accept the idea of impermanence and death, whilst we will still grieve, because we always grieve things that we love or things that we place meaning upon when they're taken away from us. But I think we can reduce the intensity of the experience of that grief if we can accept this idea of the inevitability of death and the unpredictability of death. And for some, that doesn't sound positive. But I guess from the Buddhist point of view, the more that we fight what is natural and normal, the more suffering we will experience. But also, death is an incredibly profound and meaningful. Like, we value life, but we don't value death. And yet, death is not the opposite of life. Death is intimately connected with life. Death walks hand in hand with life. They're not separate. They're not mutually exclusive. They are completely mutually inclusive. But we treat life and death as if they are opposites, as if there is no connection between them. And that, for me, is really sad, because it stops us from valuing both. We value life, and we should also value death, because it's an incredibly beautiful experience to be with someone who, particularly if they just inhale and then exhale, and that life has ceased.
You mentioned the work of Dr. Libby Salnow in the UK, and what you were just saying then reminds me of her and her work with the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. What is it about her work that is particularly appealing to you?
I liked her work for a couple of reasons. One is that when she did this research project for the Lancet Commission, she brought in not just palliative people. She brought in philosophers and educators and religious people. Like, all aspects of society were involved in this process. The other thing that she really saw through this research is how death has been pathologized and medicalized. Whereas, there are many cultures in the world that don't do that, where death is still sad. People still experience grief, but they appreciate the cycle and the naturalness of death and dying. Whereas when you're medicalizing and pathologizing, the value is only placed on life. What you're trying to do is constantly extend our lifespan, irrespective of whether you have a quality of life or not. Whereas many other cultures appreciate the interconnectedness and interdependence of all of these things. There's one culture, I think it's in Indonesia, where every 12 months or so, they actually dig up their dead and they offer them food, and sometimes they even bring them into their home and sit them at the table and put them in new clothes, because they have this whole different construct around what life and death and dying and after death means. But in the West, because we've started to medicalize and pathologize, which really has only been since medicines and hospitals in particular have come into existence. Before that, of course, we didn't do that because we didn't have the capacity to extend life in the way that we do now. But I think the more that we try and hide death away in hospitals, the more that continues. And so what Libby Salno was saying, that we've actually got to get back to valuing death and seeing it for the normal and natural part of life as it is, and not fight it.
Not as a failure.
No, not as a failure. Correct. That's a beautiful word. No, death is not a failure. We don't have to fight it. We can be proactive. If we have illness, and there's treatment for illness, we can absolutely be proactive around that. But we use this language that we've got to fight death, and we look at it from this most violent sort of perspective. And I think it's just really sad. Therefore, then how we treat people who are dying, we pathologize that. I've certainly known people in my work in palliative care where they have no quality of life, but constantly people are saying, but try this and try this and try this. All it does is bring further suffering for everybody, for the person themselves, but for their families, because we've been conditioned to think that life should be long.
And frankly, for many people, it takes them into poverty, takes the remaining family into poverty.
It's so unpredictable, but we seem to not want to allow natural death unless it arrives at old age. Whereas for some people, even if you have illness, what we do is, because it's medicalized, if somebody has a terminal illness, what we do is we treat it until they are palliative. We've got to have these constant labels. So now you're palliative. Well, now you can die naturally. But for some people, treatment is enormously painful, creates an enormous amount of suffering. And yet we've created this construct or this idea that we must do that because there's something wrong if somebody just chooses to, irrespective of what the disease might be, to just allow the disease to take its course. And I'm not saying people should do one thing or another, but I think what Libby Salno says is that we've gone too far into the medicalizing and pathologizing of illness and dying and death, rather than just allowing people to choose for themselves.
So how do you feel about voluntary and assisted dying and the increasing desire of the population to have it legislated?
It is difficult, and I acknowledge that many people have philosophical, ideological, religious-based views around this. And certainly from a Buddhist doctrinal perspective, one of our main precepts is do not kill. But for me, again, personally, this is just my own perspective, I feel neutral about the idea of voluntary assisted dying. I am neither for nor against it. I have no idea how I might respond if I get to a point where my suffering is so great, particularly again as not a particularly realized practitioner or skillful practitioner. But what I do understand is that people who wish to use voluntary assisted dying are suffering. I don't see one form of suffering differently to any other form of suffering. And so my idea of it is whether somebody experiences some form of suffering that takes them through to what may be, from a time frame perspective, a particular lifespan, an appointed lifespan, and there's suffering through that, or whether the suffering manifests as a wish to use voluntary assisted dying. For me, it's just about offering somebody warm-heartedness and care and love, understanding their place of suffering within that. Yeah.
So, as a spiritual care practitioner, what is your most important message that you would give to people who you counsel on at the stage of death and dying?
The most important thing is to be relaxed. Don't worry, don't stress about it. Be as proactive in life as you wish, but death will come and it's okay. It's not a bad thing. My most important task is to help people relax. Be relaxed. Have as peaceful a mind and heart as you possibly can. Focus on the love. Just focus on sharing the love, receiving the love, and then it's highly likely that your time of death will be peaceful, calm, relaxed, gentle. Be angry, be stressed, be resentful, be bitter, be envious, have those sorts of things in your mind. Highly unlikely that you will have a peaceful death. We all just want to be able to take that breath in and breathe out that last exhalation as gently as we can. So for me, that's the extent of my responsibility. Whether or not I have the capacity to do it with some people is not always the case, but my purpose is always to try and help people and those around them, not just the person themselves, to just be as relaxed and as peaceful and rejoice in a peaceful death.
It's very often the family and the loved ones who surround the person that create a sense of tension and friction at the end.
Yes, I've experienced on a number of occasions where family who may be very attached to the person who's dying and project that attachment through their grief or through their emotions. And again, understandably, I'm not judging that at all because I totally get why people are like that. But it's been a number of times where loved ones may have left the room and the person dies because, it's like, I wonder if they just take the opportunity to have that moment in quiet and peacefulness away from all of the emotion. And what we as Buddhists say is die in solitude, away from all of those people that are showing their sadness and loss.
Do you think about your own death?
Every day. Every single day. Yes, of course, because it could be today. I don't know that it's not going to be today. So yes, we meditate on death. We meditate on our own death every single day in preparation because we want to make sure that our mind is what we might use the term virtuous. We want to make sure when the time of death comes that we are thinking about loving kindness and compassion and wishing all beings to be free of suffering. So we practice that, we practice having that mindset and becoming familiar with that mindset. So when the time of death does come for us, we're familiar with having that type of mindset and not be caught up in anger or sadness or resentment or whatever. So yeah, death is part of my daily meditation practice and impermanence. Yeah, every day.
So what you're saying is your body in any one life is just a vessel for your consciousness. When you die, your life extinct and your own, what do you want to have happen to your actual body at that point? Do you care?
I guess the issue for me is that, so whether I am buried, whether I am cremated, I have great confidence in this idea of energy. So if you're buried, there is energy in the earth. If you're cremated, there's energy in the fire. And the energy of those things merges with your energy, which is why for me, We practice meditating so that we can make sure that we can draw upon our loving kindness and compassion, and hopefully wisdom as well. Whether or not the case remains to be seen, but certainly, loving kindness and compassion, that we can bring that into our conscious awareness, so that even though the body has gone, the energy of our form, the energy of our body can merge with that energy of earth or the energy of fire. Because I think that's really important, because energy can't be destroyed. That energy goes out into the ether. And my hope would be that there is some element of that absorption of those energetic leave in the form of loving kindness and compassion, and that goes out into the universe. Whether or not scientifically that happens, I don't know. But for me, that's the most important thing, not necessarily the means. The means of how those energies merge isn't so vitally important. Both of them can be environmentally problematic because we're running out of burial space. And of course, the smoke from the fire is polluting. I mean, to be perfectly honest, if I had my way, if the law wasn't opposed to it, I'd be really happy, for my body to be dumped somewhere out in the middle of Central Australia and let the animals come and eat me. May my body sustain many others, but I don't know that would be allowed.
Thanks to our guest, Venerable Tsultrim, and of course Barbara Sullivan, who's one of our regular contributors. Before we go, listeners of Passing Thoughts know that I love great TV. The other night I found myself binge-watching Dying for Sex. The 8-part series stars award-winning actress Michelle Williams as Molly, a woman diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. Molly decides that if she's going to die, she's going to spend the time she has left figuring out who she really is, including what she wants sexually. Her best friend Nikki, played brilliantly by Jenny Slate, is along for the ride. And yes, there is plenty of sex. There are dates, fantasies, awkward encounters, and some wonderfully funny moments. But underneath all of that is a much more interesting question. What happens when you know you are going to die? Molly's story was inspired by the real-life experience of Molly Cochin, who was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer and died in 2019, aged just 45. She and Nikki Boyer originally told the story through a podcast, which became the basis for the television series. What I found most compelling wasn't Molly's search for sex, it was her search for herself, and the creation of an unconventional bucket list. We often think of a bucket list as something cheerful and aspirational. Places we want to visit, things we want to experience, perhaps a few adventures we want to squeeze in before we die. But a bucket list can be much more personal than that. It can be about the things we've denied ourselves, the conversations we've avoided, the relationships we've left unresolved. It could even be the experiences we've been too frightened, embarrassed, or busy to pursue. Facing death strips away a lot of the things we normally worry about, what people think, what's respectable and what's expected of us. And Molly starts asking questions that many of us avoid for decades. What do I really want? What have I always wanted to do? And perhaps the biggest question, if I knew I only had a limited amount of time left, what would be on my bucket list? Because we tend to talk about dying as though everything stops when the diagnosis arrives. But Molly's story suggests something different. Sometimes knowing you're going to die can make you more determined to live. Dying for sex is funny, sad, sometimes uncomfortable, and ultimately rather life-affirming. I've actually put out feelers to the team that made Dying for Sex to see if they would like to be on Passing Thoughts, so you never know. But in the meantime, if you have the inclination, you should watch Dying for Sex, as it is genuinely one of the best shows I have ever seen. Passing Thoughts is made possible through funding from the Wicking Trust and the invaluable support from the team at 2RPH. If you have feedback, topic suggestions, or would like to share your own experiences, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at passingthoughts@2rph.com.au. Don't forget to rate and review Passing Thoughts wherever you listen to podcasts, as it really helps others discover the show. I'm Rob Caldor. Thanks for listening to Passing Thoughts.
This is a Radio 2 RPH production.